Okay, so we're on to our third week of reverse engineering as we learn how to light. Just like last week, I've got 4 of my images that I'm going to reverse engineer alongside you. If you don't know what the skills that I'm talking about are, and you don't know how to look for these clues, go back 2 weeks to the reverse engineering video where I take you through all the basics. But meanwhile, let's get stuck in. So I've picked a cross-section of images that we'll examine in depth, and I'll talk you through the reverse engineering for each one. Now, whilst all of these will display to some degree the 4 basic characteristics of light, we're not going to take every single image apart in every single facet because that would get a bit overwhelming. But they've all been picked to illustrate certain key characteristics and also to show you a few dirty tricks that photographers have up their sleeve. Okay, so we're starting to get a bit crafty, and you know to be on the lookout for a photographer trying to pull the wool over your eyes and disguise how they lit a shot. Here's a good mystery to get your teeth into. Let's look at the basics. We've got a light up top, the chandelier, and we've obviously got another light coming from high left of camera that Brian has turned his face up to. You can probably do your own detective work on the quality of light used, but what I want to look at in more detail is the quantity of light. The image is sharp from the toes of Brian's shoes all the way to the cushions on the sofa behind him, so we can assume a small aperture was used. Yet, how does this combine with the chandelier above him, which probably puts out very little light? Look more closely at the area around the chandelier, particularly off to the right, and you'll see that I've cheated. How could a chandelier inside this fold of material manage to throw light onto the other side of the material? Well, easily if it wasn't actually the chandelier that was throwing the light. Here's the setup shot, and if you look closely behind the silver reflector that's helping to lift the shadows, you'll see a flash head pointing up at the chandelier. There's the trick. By shining light onto it, I can give the impression that the chandelier is actually lit and casting light down onto Brian. Using flash lets me shoot at a decent aperture rather than having to struggle with the feeble output of a household bulb. Again, I apologise for the slightly shoddy quality of this behind-the-scenes shot. It was taken by my assistant, who has since been severely reprimanded. Hopefully, though, it's just enough to show you what the setup was. Let's stick with quantity, with this image from an adventure race in the Surrey Hills a few years back. Feast your eyes on this. We can see straight away that there are highlights on more than one side, and cast shadows on more than one side. So we know there are probably a couple of lights on the go. We can also see that the runner is frozen mid-jump, so we can guess that a fast shutter speed was used. Look more closely and we can also see that we're in a wood, and that whilst the sun is out and casting shadows on the ground, our runner is probably in the shade. So are we dealing with lots of light or not much light? Well, the answer, to be truthful, is both. Here's the setup shot. The secret is in the 3 flash guns you can see dotted around the fallen log the runner has to jump over. There are 2 behind him and 1 to his front. The 2 backlights help to separate him from the forest behind, and the front light obviously adds light to his face and torso so he's not in silhouette. The real magic, though, is in the quantity of light. Since we've managed to freeze movement and actually got a pretty decent aperture too, how have we managed to do this in the darkness of a shaded wood? The key is the flash guns. Little battery-powered flash guns like this normally struggle to have much effect in bright daylight, as their power relative to the sun is pretty weak. However, head deep into the woods and suddenly they become relatively more powerful. Since the duration of the flashes is very brief, mere hundredths or even thousandths of a second, and our runner is lit pretty much only by the light from the flashes, then that flash duration effectively becomes our shutter speed, allowing us to really freeze motion, even when there's not actually much light about. Here's a portrait from a personal project I shot a few years ago. Take it all in and do your usual detective work, but I want to take us back a few steps and talk a little bit more about direction of light, with particular reference to that magical little thing called feathering that we talked about. The highlights on either side of Mike's body and arms have probably told you that he was lit from both sides. And the fairly gentle graduation of shadows says that the light was probably quite soft. So we can count 2 lights straight away. Look more closely at the top of Mike's head and the weight plate. If the 2 lights are coming from each side, how is there also light on the top of his head and the rim of the plate? And while we're at it, what about that shaft of light that's running down the background? Now here's a great example of feathering in action, as well as one light being put to 2 uses. Look at this setup shot and you'll see that you are right about the 2 lights. There they are behind him on each side with softboxes attached. But check out the angle of the 3rd light on the overhead gantry. It's angled, or feathered. Remember, feathering is just a fancy way of talking about how you angle a light to make use of the natural fall off. It's angled onto the top of Mike, but towards the background as well. The fall of light from the overhead softbox is such that it's quite dramatic towards the edges. So by angling it back this way, I've stopped it from hitting the front of Mike and flattening the shadows I've laboured to create. The shape of the fall off, along with the angle it's at, has also allowed me to create that graduated look on the background. One light doing 2 jobs, and all through a careful arrangement of its angle and use of feathering. For our last bit of reverse engineering, let's examine an image I took about 10 years ago for a jewellery catalogue. Here's our model Sam, all dolled up in her finery with her lovely snazzy jewellery on, with the sun just setting over her shoulder, or something like that. You should of course know by now that appearances can be very deceiving. There's obviously a light coming from over her shoulder and it looks a bit like the setting or possibly rising sun, and then there's a subtle shadow beneath her chin which implies there's another light above her too. Let's look at how it was actually shot. Dealing with the overhead light first, that's clearly lighting her face, and we can see that I've used a flash head with a softbox attached, and that it's mounted on something that looks like a goalpost, which is in fact what this arrangement of stands is known as. Whilst the softbox is pretty soft, the quality of light is made even softer by the fact that it's pretty close to Sam, so the relative size is even greater. All this contributes to making things look pretty flattering and natural. Over her shoulder is the sun. Since I can't control the movement of the sun, and since the client wants a warm atmosphere to the shot, I've simply added an orange gel to a second flash head and hidden it away behind the bamboo so as to disguise it a little. Dirty little tricks like this can be used with care to augment your images, and it's well worth having a few up your sleeve. There you go, your very own toolkit to go out and reverse engineer images. Now, the more you practice this, the better you'll get. But I ought to stress the importance of broadening your influences and drawing from as wide a range of sources as possible. If you've done my free course on the 5 habits that will make you a better photographer, and if not, why not? It's free. Then you'll know that one of the things I'm very big on is your influences as a photographer, the work that you draw inspiration from. Even when you reverse engineer other photographers' work, you're not actually trying to copy them. You're simply learning the tools they use to put together their images and drawing different bits from different photographers, different images to create your own vision. You may look at someone else's work and try and copy it verbatim. And I can assure you, if you do, you are doomed to failure. Even if you took exactly the same subject to exactly the same place, used exactly the same lighting, exactly the same time of day, you still wouldn't be able to reproduce their work exactly. And why would you want to? You want to create your own work. You will create better work by getting better at decoding the signs and the clues hidden in other photographers' work, drawing on all of those, taking a piece from here, a piece from there, learning how this photographer lights, this photographer uses that sort of imagery, and this photographer uses this technique, bringing it all together to create your own vision. But learning how to reverse engineer is a vital skill in that greater toolkit. Okay, that's it for reverse engineering. Next week, in Learning How to Light, I'm going to talk about modifiers, tools you can use to change the quality of your light.